Here we go with chapter 16, the Renaissance. So the Renaissance is divided into three categories, early, high, and northern, for the purposes of this chapter. And of course, we'll start with the early. First, some key terms we'll be looking at are oil painting, sfumato, and chiaroscuro, which we have talked about chiaroscuro before when we talked about value and drawing, I believe. And you can have that with drawing, but you can also do it with painting. It's just showing dramatic lights and darks. We will talk about linear and atmospheric perspective, which is also something we've talked about before, but we'll see that played out in the Renaissance artwork. The concept of humanist and how that way of thinking dominated this time period of the Renaissance. Plato and Neoplatonism, what an art patron is, the Medici family, the Academy, what that means for the art world, and mannerism. Mannerism is capitalized because it is like an art time period, or we call them art movements. So we've started kind of breaking the history up already using this terminology, and I haven't made it super clear, but you can start thinking of it this way, because as we go along, after today's lecture, you'll really start to hear names for these time periods of art. And that is done because it just sort of categorizes art history into what the purpose of the art at that time was. Maybe it was a new technique or style that was happening at that time. And so you will want to start thinking about art history in terms of these names. And mannerism is one of those. Also, the Renaissance is one of those. So just to let you know what we've talked about so far, we talked about the oldest art. That was like a time period, which could encompass, it could be thought of as a broad one, which encompasses Mesopotamia and Egypt, Sumer, Babylonian art, all those little things that we talked about, little different regions of the world, more like, they kind of fit under that category as of ancient art. And then we talked about Greek. Now that usually gets its own time period. That usually gets its own art category or art movement. So you have Greek art, and then you have Roman art. Those are all generally thought of as time periods. Then we have early Christian art. That usually gets its own category. Byzantium gets its own category. And then we have the Middle Ages that we talked about last time. And that could be broken down into early and high. So just to kind of let you see, you've already learned several of these art movements. We've just, they're not quite as distinct in these older ones that we've already gone through. But like I said, you will start seeing very clear titles when we get into Impressionism and Cubism and things like that. Okay, so the Renaissance covers the period from roughly 1400 to 1600, and that's only like 200 years, which is very short in comparison to the other time periods we've been talking about. Just a brief period of time, but has some of the most dramatic impact on culture and art history. Everyone has heard of the Renaissance. You know, that's just kind of a well-known thing. And the artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo, that's a well-known thing. So, but we're going to look at what the Renaissance actually is. It actually means rebirth, and it refers to the revival of interest in ancient Greek and Roman culture. So we've just studied ancient Greek and Roman culture and art. As time went on, those classical cultures kind of got covered a little bit, kind of got buried in history. And then this Renaissance time period is like rediscovering those things. In fact, they had many excavations and archaeological discoveries of ancient Greek things, including some of the things that have been buried by volcano ash And so they had a lot of rediscovery, in fact, of some of this art and things from the Greek time period. So that played into it as well, like a rediscovering of those things. It's kind of like, oh, wow, these Greeks were really, really advanced. We need to copy what was already discovered. Like looking back to move forward is really the idea behind the Renaissance. Looking back at the past and then making great strides to move forward. Keep in mind, we've just come off of the Middle Ages, which artistically we would not say is dark and ignorant, right? We kind of talked about that last time. Like there's a ton of rich, amazing artwork from that time period. But it was a lull in history, you could say, and a very long one. And because conditions were so bad during the Middle Ages, and there was no like central government over all of Europe, it was just sort of like every man for himself, living hand to mouth kind of survival mode for the majority of people. Lots of plague and death and disease and things. Low education, not a lot of money. So you can see why when things started to take a turn economically, socioeconomically, and this discovery and re-examining of ancient cultures that had so much to offer, it's just kind of like that whole idea, looking back to move forward. So anyway, back to the sentence here. It says, it refers to the revival of interest in ancient Greek and Roman culture. This interest is one of the key characteristics of the period. Make sure you're taking notes on all these slides. The new and very rich merchant class joined nobility and clergy as art patrons. So jot down something about that statement, just to understand art prior to that. Only, if you recall from last lecture, Bibles were copied by monks and illustrated. Remember the illustrated manuscripts, the illuminated manuscripts. Paintings and images that were used for cathedrals and churches were entirely paid for by the church. In some cases, artists were even just forced to paint. They didn't really get a choice. They were just, that's just what they did. Oh, you're good at art, so you're going to create these artworks for our cathedral. But it was all church sponsored. So this is a really big shift in what's going on in the world. We have this new merchant class that has risen up off of the Mediterranean Sea. Primarily, we focus on Italy. And they now join the nobility. They're very rich, and they join this higher class of people, as well as religious people. So we kind of have money infiltrating the church, which is not good. And they become the art patrons. They are the sole and primary people paying artists to make art. And when you have money in a civilization, when you have money, it allows for the buying and selling of art and the flourishing of the arts, literature, creativity. There's more leisure time. There's just more money to go around to support these types of projects. And that's why you see a boom in the arts like that. When you have a culture that is extremely poor and is just surviving, you're not going to have the extreme boom of art that you would otherwise. Now, what we've kind of learned through this entire semester is there is always art, though, correct? Like even when a civilization has almost nothing and they're just surviving, such as cave paintings, there is some form of art that always happens. It's part of our human experience. In the Middle Ages, yes, very much survival mode, but yet there was a lot of rich art. So just to hopefully give you a little bit of background thinking of that. Before we move into it also, the Renaissance artists are just thought of as masters. You may have heard that term before, like the masters of painting, the masters of sculpture. They just have this title that goes down in history as being the best artist ever. And just think in your head, do you think that those artists just had more talent than anybody else at any other time? Were they superior in some way? What do you think about that? Or do you think, it, as I've just explained, it was more the circumstances surrounding them? We don't know. We can't know, but something to think about. There was a lot of discovery about art technique and art production, and really artists just pushing themselves to be the best and to really develop their craft, be it painting or sculpture or whatever it was. And again, those are the high arts: painting, sculpture, drawing, printmaking. Not so much ceramics or other types of glass making or things like that. This is where there's a great divide between the craft and the fine art, really. Okay, so this map shows you Europe during the Renaissance, kind of the regions that are influenced by that burst of art and culture and literature and music. Scientific developments as well. That's a really important thing to remember. We, in the art world, tend to talk about just the visual art things, but there were many other discoveries and innovations at this time as well. Okay, and then so you can kind of get an idea where we're looking at, what we're talking about. This is primarily the home of the Renaissance, Florence, Rome, primarily Florence. But you have the effects blooming all the way out. You have France certainly influenced, Spain influenced. You have up here what we would call a whole different Renaissance, and that's called in the art world the Northern Renaissance. And we will actually study that as a separate thing next chapter. It's artwork near the same time period. Also, tremendous development in what it looks like as far as skill and technique, but looks a lot different. It just looks very different than what the Italian Renaissance artists were doing. So during the Renaissance, artists were learned persons whose creative powers were viewed as almost miraculous. They were considered a breed apart from because of their abilities, and they transcended social class. Think about what that means for a moment. Do you think that modern artists are viewed that way, as separate from normal society in some way? Are they viewed as extra special? If you were really involved in the modern art world or aware of it or looking at it, you might almost gain that perspective because generalizing the art world, artists are seen as having some special thing that the average person doesn't. And so that does sort of make them as almost like a special class of person. Now, at this time period in the Renaissance, it was like it says, almost miraculous. They were viewed as just almost like a supernatural type of person. And again, to reiterate what I said previously, painting, sculpture, and architecture, I left that one out, were held as intellectual activities allied with mathematics, science, and poetry. So all of those things are elevated as just highly respected, desired, special qualities. The mixture of those artistic qualities and design qualities with intellectual qualities. The Renaissance was influenced by the Greek philosopher Plato. Beauty became equated with moral goodness. Renaissance artists sought an idealized beauty. So what does idealized mean? Think about that for a second. What does that word idealized mean? Kind of not possible. when you have ideals that are very specific, and if you're a person who idealizes situations, you're kind of hoping for something beyond what's possible. And so with these artists, they were creating and wanting beauty to be beyond what was natural, like the most perfect of beauty. Now, we've talked about aesthetics before. What is beauty? That's can depend on who's looking at it, but we also have sort of like these human innate things that give us sort of a compass on what beauty is. Oh, this is beautiful and this is not beautiful. That person's beautiful, this person's not beautiful. And so these artists were taking it to a level of just elevating the look of something so much and seeking perfection. Beauty became equated with moral goodness. Like, if you're beautiful, that means you're good. You can write good equals beauty in your notes to get the point of that. Equals perfect. Humankind was viewed as God's finest and most perfect creation. So we really have religion intertwined, or the understanding of God and understanding of Christianity, but it's intertwined in this new way of thinking of humanism, where it's almost like, wow, we humans are just so incredible. We can do anything. Look at what we can do. Look at the art we can make. Look at the science we can discover. Look at the books we can write and the philosophy we can think of, and just really elevating humans to just be quite proud of themselves. Now they're giving, God exists, yes. God made us, yes. God's all powerful and wonderful, but we are perfect. We are God's perfect creation. So that just kind of elevates humans to pretty boastful, proud perspective. So this is what humanism is, where humans are the focus, humans are the center, humans can do anything. We are God's finest, most perfect creation. Not very biblical, right? We are supposed to be humble. We are supposed to understand God is omniscient, omnipresent, all the omnis. He is everywhere. He is in control. He's sovereign. He's perfect. He's divine. We are sinful. We are sinful humans that need him entirely. We are pretty helpless by ourselves. That's really more the biblical view we should have as humans. And so it was really twisting that around. It reminds me of culture today, honestly. It reminds me of how we are encouraged to develop ourselves to be our best, and which isn't wrong. Don't get me wrong. That's okay. But just this mindset of we can do anything. We are capable of anything. We are incredible creatures. You are wonderful, and you can. It just crosses the line of where we should be with God, and that we are humble and subordinate to him. It's just a careful line, a careful balance we have to maintain. And I think a lot of the trouble of the Renaissance and where that led to is similar to our culture today, in elevating ourselves, creating little kingdoms of our own rather than understanding God. We are incredibly blessed and privileged to even be a part of God's kingdom. Reason and creativity were considered God's gifts. So when you have reason and creativity, you just have more of God's gift bestowed on you, which isn't necessarily wrong again. It's just that sort of prideful. It's just that twist a little bit of the thinking of it, where putting yourself too high, maybe. And isn't that the Tower of Babel too in the Bible? Humans were trying to reach God, to be God. Isn't that why Satan fell from heaven? Why Lucifer was cast out of heaven? He wanted to be like God. It's just a dangerous ground to tread on, that sort of humanist thinking. Renaissance artists worked to reproduce the natural world as accurately as possible. Studying the effects of light, they developed a technique of chiaroscuro, which is creating dramatic lights and darks, very soft shadows, and a very realistic representation of how light affects form. Noting that the distant objects appeared smaller than near ones, they developed the system of linear perspective, which we talked about in previous chapters, where you have things convert, lines do converge. There's a mathematical system that's happening there that God created and God designed, and we just figured it out a little bit. There's a vanishing point and a horizon line, and things converge back to that visually. That's linear perspective. Seeing how detail and color blurred with distance, they developed the principles of atmospheric perspective. And anytime you look out at a far distance, whether it's in the hills, the mountains, near water, in a field even, just look out and see how things do blur, and color gets kind of duller and lighter, and detail is not able to be determined when you look out across a distance. That's atmospheric perspective. Artists studied anatomy, even dissecting cadavers to fully understand the human form. You've probably heard of Leonardo da Vinci. He was very much one of these artists who would dissect cadavers to understand the muscle structure, the bone structure of humans. They really wanted to understand it in order to sculpt, draw, paint it well. And that is an important part. I don't know that art schools have you do that, but I know that they have you do a lot of anatomy studies. Anatomical understanding is very important to be an artist who can properly render what the human form looks like and have an understanding of it. So let's start with our first section. Remember, we'll have the early Renaissance, the high Renaissance, and then the last section very quickly on this time period called Mannerism. So the early Renaissance is characterized by the work of artists like Donatello, Masaccio, and Botticelli. If you recall, in our last lecture, I talked about the artist Giotto and the Lamentation. Giotto is also kind of considered this, he really goes back and forth. He could be Middle Ages, high Middle Ages, or he could be early Renaissance. But it's really just, he's kind of that transition guy. Oops. So Donatello, Masaccio, and Botticelli are our main guys for this early Renaissance time period. I'll show you an example of art by each of them. Is that right? Yeah, I'm going to show you one from each of these artists. So Donatello was a sculptor. His work reflects humanist interest in ancient Greek and Roman art. The nude human body thought of as God's most perfect creation. So while we see a sculpture or a painting that's of a nude human, it kind of is shocking to us and it seems weird, right? When you go to an art museum and you see a lot of nude sculptures. But if you're understanding it from this perspective of what they thought, like they were just so humanist thinking that the human body is just perfect. And so why would you cover it up? Why would you clothe it? And these representations of people that they were sculpting and painting were idealized perfection. So they wanted to show the entire body. So here's an example, which I have censored for you. This is by Donatello, and it's the sculpture called the David. Now, the interesting thing about this one is it's a very early Renaissance sculpture. It is bronze, so it's been through that casting process that we talked about before. And this was influenced quite a bit from early Roman and Greek, as that previous statement said. So Donatello is looking back. He's looking at these artists from antiquity, as we call it, the classical time period of Greek and Roman art. And he's understanding how they saw the human form. And he's very much imitating that style. The sort of contrapposto pose, remember that word, where he's putting the weight on one foot. And he is representing, this is David from the Bible, so he is representing David as a boy. You can see he's a young man. He's not an old man. He looks pretty young. And so just notice those things about this, because later we'll be looking at Michelangelo's The David, which is from the High Renaissance, and I think you'll see a pretty big difference between those two sculptures. It is very detailed. If you're looking at the face and the musculature, it feels real. It feels like it's a very accurate sculpture. But I think as you see later ones, you'll see they are even more almost like the real presence of a person. Remember, they're trying to create idealized forms, like the perfect image of something. And this subject matter is biblical still. A lot of the subject matter in the Renaissance time period is biblical, is based on Christianity. However, you will see also quite a bit of Greek mythology. Couldn't think of the word. Greek mythology with gods and goddesses and just different stories about that, illustrated and painted as well. Okay, then our next artist is Masaccio, also a painter. Well, let me go back. Donatello was primarily a sculptor. Make sure you get that down. Primarily a sculptor, Donatello. Now I'm jumping to the Masaccio slide. He was a painter, and he used this new technique of linear perspective. Once artists figured that out, once they could see, oh, there's like a formula we can use, and when we have a vanishing point and the lines converge to the vanishing point, it creates a very convincing deep space on our flat canvas. It looks like it goes back, and so they were just, mesmerized by this perspective concept. I don't know if you remember, but the concept of perspective was actually figured out not just by observation, not by just artists looking out at a building or a landscape and seeing, oh, the lines, they appear to converge. It was actually figured out with the camera obscura, if you recall that part when we were talking about photography. When the camera obscura was used, and light would enter, remember, it would flip what was seen from outside. It went through a tiny hole, and it would flip the image onto a wall inside the little box that the artist would be in. And through drawing and copying those images from the projection, which is actually kind of cheating in the art world, they could see, oh, there's a system here. The lines are converging. There is what appears to be an imaginary point called the vanishing point. And so that was due to the camera obscura. But once these artists figured it out and learned how to use it, it's very frequently used in artworks of this time period. Lots of architecture is painted in. So, for example, where would the vanishing point be? If you were following these lines, do you see them? Where are they converging to? I'm trying to see. Kind of like down here, right? Almost Christ's knees in that image. But these lines are converging to a vanishing point. What is a vanishing point? It's an imaginary line. This is the horizon line. Oops, probably a little more up here. Sorry. This is the horizon line. And all these lines of the architecture, these in this part that looks like it's going back in space, would be converging to that imaginary dot that's right on the horizon line, also known as eye level. So in this image, that is our eye level. Now, these edges down here are part of the scene. So even like right there and right there, you can't see some of these little things in here. Like for instance, right here, the thickness of this and the shadow. If you could follow those lines, they too would be heading towards the vanishing point, which feels kind of like right here. We'll call that the vanishing point. Okay, so this is Masaccio. It's called Trinity with the Virgin, St. John the Evangelist, and Donors. So let's talk about what that means. So what's happening in this painting is you have the Trinity. You have Jesus, God the Father, and that's the dove representing the Holy Spirit. You have, it says with John the Evangelist. So one of these is John, probably this one. And I don't know if this represents Mary Magdalene or who this is, but then you have the patron saints out here. So these are the donors. So these are the people who have paid to have it done. So they're kind of getting a 2-in-1. They're getting this painting made, plus they're getting like a portrait of themselves put into it. So there's a little bit of recognizing themselves and kind of putting themselves in there. Like, look at this painting that we paid to have done. From what I've read, the bones down here at the bottom represent just the gravity of death and how without trusting in Jesus, we just have death to look forward to. Like nothing spiritual, nothing eternal, but this. So it's kind of like a sobering element of that. Okay, so interesting, Masaccio only painted probably painted several things, but 3 are really well-known Renaissance pieces. And then he died shortly after painting, just a few months after painting this Trinity with the Virgin. And our last example of an early Renaissance artist is Botticelli. He was a painter. He worked for the Medici family who commissioned secular artwork. The Medici family were very wealthy merchant family in Italy, Florence, Italy. Oh, it says that on here. And so secular would mean just like non-Christian, outside of the faith, just everyday worldly stuff. So Medici, a wealthy merchant class family who were art patrons, they sponsored the Academy, or an academy, which was a discussion group where humanist scholars and artists met to discuss classical culture and its relationship to Christianity. Sounds fascinating. These two combined systems of thought created a philosophy known as Neoplatonism. So just kind of grasp that with your mind, what that's saying there. This basically they were people who loved art and humanist and scholarly discussions, philosophy, and so they had this academy, a discussion group, and just this deep discussion time about classical culture and its relationship to Christianity. So that's a lot of things in one sentence, but I want to make sure you get all of the basic definitions of these things down. Humanist scholars, we've talked about what humanism is. Again, that's kind of the focus on human ability and achievement, what humans are capable of, that we are the best creation and the height of creation of what God made. Okay, so Botticelli, here is a very well-known work by him called Primavera. Give me a second to look that over. One thing while I'm thinking of it before I go into this one is back to Masaccio's Trinity with the Virgin. This is a fresco painting. So that's that technique where they paint into the plaster on a wall. This painting, Primavera, is actually a large tempera painting on a poplar wood panel. So it's believed to have been executed about 1477 to 1482, which your dates here say 1481 to 84, somewhere in that vicinity. The mythological features in the painting are an allegory of spring and the kindling of love. After training as a goldsmith, Botticelli was apprenticed to Fra Filippo Lippi. Lippi had developed a style of portraying expressive interactions between figures and employing highly decorative detailed, which was typical of the late Gothic period. Botticelli was also influenced by Antonio Paoluo, whose muscular modeling announced a new approach to figurative work, accounting for human anatomy and proportion. And if you just look at the bodies of these people, you can really see a jump in just the understanding of anatomy, the muscles, the forms, the figures themselves. Let me just click back to this one real quick. Just a little more, of course, these guys have lots of draping on, but a little more realistic rendering somehow. A little more, it seems like a deeper understanding of the human anatomy, but and expressive. So he gained that from working with other artists. Some scholars have argued that the painting is an example of Botticelli's interest in Neoplatonism, a blending of pagan and Christian identities. However, it's probable that he painted this mythological scene because he was commissioned to do so by the Medicis, who could pay for such things. So maybe he was just commissioned to do it, but it's secular in that it's all about the mythological stories of different characters. No one can really understand how these different characters have all been placed together here. It's like they took different little segments of different mythology stories and put them together. But it does have to do with most likely spring, love, and nothing really biblical based on it at all. Okay, now we're going to switch over and go into the High Renaissance. It lasted only about 25 years and ended around 1520. The most outstanding and recognized artists of this period are, of course, Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. Other well-known artists include Raphael, Titian, and Giordano. So you want to get all those names down. We're going to go through, just checking, I think we're just going to go through a couple of examples of Da Vinci and Michelangelo, some well-known examples. So first of all, Da Vinci, he embodies the term Renaissance man. Many consider him to have been the greatest genius who ever lived. He was a painter, inventor, sculptor, architect, engineer, scientist, and musician. So that's what the term Renaissance man means. If you ever hear that, it's just someone who can do a lot of things and do them well. All different aspects of creativity. But he did leave many works uncompleted. So our first example is the Da Vinci study of human proportions, which you've probably seen this. It's very much a common symbol that's used on medical things. And it represents in learning, like the proportion of the human body in these two positions fit inside of a circle and a square, just like that. And then you can see all of his writings and thinking about how that works and why it works that way. That studying of proportion goes back to the idea of classical antiquity and idealism and trying to find the perfect proportions, ideal proportions for the human body. Okay, and then Da Vinci's other famous works include the Mona Lisa. Well, he has lots of famous works, but the ones that you might have seen before are the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. And then we have this new term, sfumato, which is Italian for smoke. and Leonardo's specialty was using this technique. It's a layering of translucent glazes, producing a hazy atmosphere, softened contours, and velvet shadows. So if it looks kind of smoky or hazy, soft, just very almost like it's made out of velvet, like it says, then you know you're looking at an example of how he could use sfumato. So this one we've looked at before and talked about it in terms of 1 point perspective, and that the lines converge to Jesus's head. Side note, on the previous test where we were talking about perspective and space, it would have been the element of space that we were discussing. On the test, I noticed the test question said, the vanishing point appears behind Jesus's head. The vanishing point is exactly in the center of the painting. It uses 1 point perspective, all of those things. And so I accepted all the answers that people put on that one because it's kind of tricky. It actually would have been all of those things were correct. But I think I emphasized that the vanishing point would be like right at the top of his head or behind his head. So anyway, do you see that sfumato effect there? Do you see the sort of smoky look? Look at this one in comparison to Botticelli's. A little more hard edges on things. It's just a difference in technique of painting. Of course, this was tempera, and I believe in the Last Supper is fresco. But that's just what he was famous for, was getting that sort of atmospheric, fuzzy look to his painting, using translucent layers. Interestingly, this is like a 1500s version of how people would be sitting at a table. That wouldn't be accurate with the time period that Jesus was in. When the Last Supper happened and they were eating the Last Supper, it would have been a Jewish style where they had a table probably low to the ground, and they would have been like sitting on the ground or sitting on low cushions and things and leaning on one elbow is how they typically would sit. So this is a kind of a modern version, 1500s version of the Last Supper. Okay, going on with the High Renaissance, we have Michelangelo. He was 25 years younger than Leonardo, but his greatest rival. So Leonardo was 25 years old when Michelangelo was born. Michelangelo was a painter, sculptor, poet, architect. The artist considered himself a sculptor above all else. I've read things that say he didn't even really like painting that much. He was an amazing painter, but he much, much preferred sculpture. And though he did just tremendous amount of painting in his career. So we'll look at some works by him. We have the other painting or sculpture I was going to tell you in comparison to Donatello's David. This is David by Michelangelo. And it is enormous. I like this picture because it shows how high up and how small the people are. So we do have a contrapposto pose again, but we have David sculpted as sort of this extremely muscular and idealized, very idealized form. Like, that's not really, how the Bible depicts what he might have looked like. It's a Renaissance style version of David. Of course, we don't know what David really looked like, but he definitely looks more just like a classical Greek sculpture, or not probably a young Hebrew boy. And this is depicting the scene of him with the slingshot, the scene in the Bible with him getting ready to slay the giant, because he has a slingshot over his shoulder here. Of course, no clothes on. Neither did Donatello's David. But I put some zoomed in images here because just looking at the detail is incredible. Like the detail of the musculature. I don't know if you can really think about how these things are made, but you have like a huge block of marble that he would have chosen, a massive piece of stone with nothing on it. And it's like finding the form within that chunk of stone, like just taking little by little away. How did he do that? How did he chisel away at this marble stone to so delicately sculpt these fingers with the creases and the fingernails and the raised veins on the hand, and just showing every tendon and bone? It's incredible if you think about it. How did he do that? And one wrong knock and you could knock a finger off and it'd be ruined. The way the feet, look at the weight that you can feel, the pressure of that weight on a foot on stone. It's just amazing if you really look at it. Interesting thing, this was originally commissioned to be on top of a building. So the proportions of it are so that things like the hands are too big for the body, because when a sculpture goes way up on top of a tall building, you lose the hands and you lose small things. The head and the hands look too small for the body. It's a visual optical illusion. So to kind of correct that, artists would intentionally make the hands and the head a little bigger than what they should be in proportion, so that when it's way up high, it looks right. It doesn't look like you can't even see the hands, or that the head is tiny. But then, since it didn't go on top of the building, it's just here in a museum to be seen. When you see it, it looks a little out of proportion that way. So we have a very Greek-style David from the Bible, King David. Also, Michelangelo, one more about him, or a couple more about him. The Sistine Chapel is another of his famous works. It is a fresco that depicts stories from the Bible's Old Testament. And I'll show you an image of the Sistine Chapel ceiling in 1 second. So just hold on to that thought. I really probably should have put this on the next slide. This is a second one here. It says he was the architect of the new St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. So if you recall, we looked at the floor plan of old St. Peter's. Remember that? But it burned. And so Michelangelo was commissioned to be the architect of this one. Now, he never saw it completed. He died before it was completed, but he was the architect and the designer behind it. So this is an example of his architecture. We've seen an example of his sculpture. And so here is the Sistine Chapel, which is an example of his painting. The Pope commissioned him to paint this, and it is said he kind of forced him to paint it. He didn't want to. As you can see, this is standing here. If you could be standing on the interior of the Sistine Chapel, you can see all of these frescoes just covering the walls of this little chapel. And then the ceiling is adorned also with the entire story from, here we can't quite see it, but this will be the creation of man. There's Adam and Eve with the snake, and then it just proceeds through the entire Bible storyline until you get down here to the end of Judgment Day and Jesus' return. So it is an incredible undertaking, and we have a video here, so I'll go ahead and play that. I'm assuming that one's on the Renaissance. I don't remember, but I think that's what it is. So we'll watch that and see several more images from this time period.
The Renaissance was a time of rebirth, an expansion for religious interpretation, scientific discovery, exploration of new lands, and the flourishing of the arts. It was a period between the 14th and 16th centuries that devalued the medieval era before it in favor of a new and brighter era that would draw inspiration from the Greek and Roman traditions of antiquity. A great paradigm shift from the dark medieval times occurred. It would produce innovative thinkers such as Nicholas Copernicus, Desiderius Erasmus, and the Renaissance artists that would become some of the most recognizable and well-loved masters in the world. The Renaissance took place primarily in Italy. The Renaissance was a time of rebirth, an expansion for religious interpretation, scientific discovery, exploration of new lands, and the flourishing of the arts. It was a period between the 14th and 16th centuries that devalued the medieval era before it in favor of a new and brighter era that would draw inspiration from the Greek and Roman traditions of antiquity. A great paradigm shift from the dark medieval times occurred. It would produce innovative thinkers such as Nicholas Copernicus, Desiderius Erasmus, and the Renaissance artists that would become some of the most recognizable and well-loved masters in the world. The Renaissance took place primarily in Italy, but its innovation and ideas reached far and wide. The medieval values that came before it encouraged obedience and faith in authority. The Renaissance was a complete shift and placed high value on knowledge and personal responsibility. The art during this time is known for its realistic scenery, linear perspective, and its innovative light and dark shadowing, known as chiaroscuro. The Renaissance began as a literary movement, with the texts of antiquity being rediscovered, but it was quickly picked up by the visual arts and sciences. Italy's intermingling between math, science, and art during this time led to the discovery of perspective in the arts. Perspective was an achievement that allowed new space to be configured in the paintings. Flat and stacked space was replaced with mathematically accurate images with dimension and depth. A chapel where God, the Virgin Mary, and Saint One example of a Renaissance painting before three-dimensional perspective is Angelo Gatti's The Coronation of the Virgin. Painted around 1370, the Coronation of the Virgin depicts 6 angels witnessing a central scene of Jesus crowning his mother Mary after her death on earth. The painting is highly detailed and features bright pastel colors and a background of radiant gold. However, the depiction is overall flat and reminiscent of the two-dimensional religious illustrations found in medieval Bibles. Masaccio's Holy Trinity is the earliest surviving painting to use linear perspective to accurately represent an architectural space. A chapel where God, the Virgin Mary, and St. John the Baptist witnessed the crucifixion of Christ. The realism of the painted chapel's depth would have impressed viewers at the time, same as 3D movies do today. During this time of flourishing artistic achievement, Italy saw the rise of powerful individuals and families. The church, as one of the most powerful and wealthy institutions in Italy, was able to commission artists to create sculptures and architecture that adorned and served church iconography and function. Christian saints were painted and sculpted to replace Byzantine mosaics and murals with Greek mythological imagery, but direct influence from antiquity on form and technique was still visible. Using antiquity as a backdrop, artists began incorporating and fusing the Christian iconography with the Greek and Roman symbols and imagery. This was most apparent in the work of Botticelli. During this time of flourishing artistic achievement, Italy saw the rise of powerful individuals and families. Italy was not a unified state during the time of the Renaissance, and while the church had considerable power and wealth during this time, the Medici family, owners of Europe's largest bank, became the most powerful dynasty in the region. Gaining their power through banking, the Medici were such a rich and political dominating force that they were able to commission hundreds of works of art and have powerful influence within the church. Prominent artists and thinkers sponsored by the Medici family include Masaccio, the painter who perfected and popularized one-point linear perspective, Fra Angelico, Donatello, and even masters like Galileo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Michelangelo. Although the Renaissance was already spreading like wildfire across northern and western Europe on its own, it was helped along by the Medici's power and influence. Leonardo was the quintessential Renaissance man. He was skilled as an artist, scientist, and architect. His interest in worldliness, beauty, love of learning, and the ideals of antiquity led him to create novel and breathtaking work.
His best-known work, and among the most famous paintings in the world, is The Last Supper, painted on the cafeteria wall of the Santa Maria del Grazie convent in Milan. The Last Supper portrays Jesus' last meal on earth with his disciples. The disciples are riddled with surprise and angst because Jesus has just revealed to them that one of them will betray him and he will die. Leonardo's work remains in the canon of artwork, but due to his constant experimentation, his works are falling apart today, and many of his ideas led to failure or never saw fruition.
Of Jesus and God's creation of the world, which includes one of the most famous paintings at the central point of the ceiling, the creation of Adam.
Michelangelo was much like Leonardo, but instead of exploring all avenues, he concentrated his skill in the arts. Although his true passion and ingenuity was put into sculpture, he designed exquisite architecture as well, and made one of the most famous paintings of all time on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel.
Michelangelo had a distinct
The Sistine Chapel took Michelangelo 4 years to complete, between 1508 and 1512. The expansive ceiling features paintings of biblical stories such as Jonah and the whale, Adam and Eve, biblical prophets, the ancestors of Jesus, and God's creation of the world, which includes one of the most famous paintings at the central point of the ceiling, the creation of Adam.
features the school of Adam.
The creation of Adam depicts God, a gray-bearded man accompanied by angels, extending his finger to Adam's outreached finger to animate him with life. The Sistine Chapel is a testament to Michelangelo's skillful depiction of intense emotion and advanced understanding of human anatomy.
Aristotle.
Michelangelo had a distinct style that matched finesse with stunning virtuosity.
Statues of Apollo and Minerva feature prominently in the school, inviting viewers to contemplate the relationship
A
between
rival painter of Michelangelo's, Raphael, decorated the walls of the Catholic Pope's library in the Vatican between 1509 and 1511. One of these Vatican walls features the School of Athens, Raphael's masterpiece. The School of Athens demonstrates Raphael's mastery of linear perspective in its realistic depiction of an elegant cross-shaped building crowded with philosophers, artists, and patrons. In the painting, philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, Epicurus, and Pythagoras debate philosophical questions and read from philosophy books. Statues of Apollo and Minerva feature prominently in the school, inviting viewers to contemplate the relationship between religion and philosophy. The Renaissance was the beginning of an exploration in style and virtuosity that can be traced through the next 300 to 400 years in the arts. The names of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael still hold sway today, and their work has become standard in the history of the world.
we consider modernity.
The Renaissance set in motion a series of inquiries and discoveries that radically changed the world, and
So that gave you a lot of other images and kind of repeated some of the same things we've already gone over with these Renaissance artists. And we will now switch gears just a bit and we'll talk about the Northern Renaissance. So far, usually when you just hear the Renaissance, you can know that people are referring to the Italian Renaissance specifically. So Southern Europe. Home place of the Renaissance being Florence, Italy. The Northern Renaissance is the Renaissance in the north, makes sense, including France, the Netherlands, and Germany, and it evolved from the late Middle Ages. Following the tradition of miniature painting and manuscript illumination, if you can remember that from our previous lecture, which focus on great detail. That's really key in understanding this and looking at these works. Visible world as opposed to studying classical excavations. So again, these Southern Italian artists were really influenced greatly by the classical excavations, discovering things from ancient Greece and studying how they were idealizing people. You won't see that quite so much in the North. They were really just doing more accurate visual studying of what they saw. So people looked like they look, and it wasn't about that idealized perfection of everybody. So where a person that looks overweight and not good proportions in the Italian Renaissance would have been just rendered as looking perfect with perfect proportions and idealized beauty. You're going to see in the North the people just looked as they looked. Skill of rendering the precise outer appearance of subject matter and everyday life, which was not what we were just looking at in the South, as opposed to idealized images. So everyday life is a big difference in the Northern Renaissance versus the Southern Renaissance. Developed technology of painting with oils. So most of the paintings from Italy are frescoes or tempera paintings. Oil paints were the technology of the North, and they look different. When you see an oil painting, it looks much different than a fresco. You'll see that, I think. And then they have rich iconography, and we talked about this before, and we'll talk about a painting that we've already looked at, which was the Arnolfini wedding portrait. Iconography meaning symbolism, where the different objects in the painting represent something else. So everyone who sees it would know those objects and they would know what the symbolism is. Okay, so one of our first examples, I would just want to show you several examples from the North, and maybe you'll see some similarity in them or how they look, how they kind of have similar characteristics. So the top one, or the one on the left, is by the Limbourg brothers, titled February. So this would have been a calendar. There would have been an image for each month of the year. And this shows you that depiction of everyday life. These are not wealthy people. These are not high nobility or clergy or church. These are just everyday scenes of farmers in a small village, what they would have been doing with their livestock and their grain, and how the landscape looked. Now, if you'll look at this, you will immediately pick out, what do you think of the perspective in this picture? In this scene, what do you think of the perspective? The perspective is not using proper one-point perspective. So things are out of proportion, things are not right size-wise. Edges of buildings and things are not converging properly. This is still, they had not figured out the laws and the mathematical rules of one-point perspective like you see in Italy. Now, clearly, they've discovered that as things go back in space, they get smaller, right? They go up the piece of paper, they overlap, they get smaller. We talked about all those things before with space. Not a lot of atmospheric perspective happening here. It kind of looks clear and sharp even in the background as it does in the front. But using some of those drawing skills of placement to create space, they could see that things have certain characteristics, like this is round and that makes it look three-dimensional. They could see that these are angular, and they try to imitate that the best they can, but since they're not following a mathematical system, it doesn't quite make sense. Look how large this guy is compared to the trees. Look how large this guy is compared to the trees and this silo. Like, he should be a lot smaller, probably. Just kind of looking at it. But yeah, everyday scene, that's the most important thing about this one. And then you have the women inside warming themselves by the fire. This one, on the other hand, you have Hans Holbein the Younger, and this is titled The Ambassadors from 1533. So look at the dates here. You're talking 100 years later, over 100 years later, that this one was created. This would be early Northern Renaissance. And you immediately, this is more typical looking of what we would call Northern Renaissance painting. You can see it's very vibrant colors, very rich colors. That's because it's done with oil paint, which gives it a whole new level of capability of using paint, giving you lots of layers of transparent layers that can be put on to create almost like shimmering effects. And then, as it said, detail. Look at the detail, even in this and the patterns on the fabric. All of these objects mean something. So that's iconography. All of these objects mean something. A little bit about this painting. I'm just going to give you some reference because it's got a lot going on and it's interesting. Holbein painted the ambassadors in England, where his skills as a portraitist earned him the position of court painter to King Louis the Eighth. The painting was commissioned by a man on the left, Jean de Dintville, the French ambassador to England. To the right is his friend George Seville, a French bishop who also served as an ambassador. They look out at us from either side of a table richly laden with objects symbolizing the four humanist sciences: music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. So take a look at all the things on the table there. The imported Islamic rug speaks of contacts with the wider world, and the globe placed on the lower shelf reminds us that the Renaissance was also the age of European exploration and discovery. Close inspection reveals that the lute resting on the lower shelf has a broken string, and that the book before it is open to a hymn by Martin Luther. This is the lute right here. We can't really see it in this slide, but that apparently has a broken string. The broken string symbolizes discord. Europe was no longer in harmony because of the difficult issues raised by Martin Luther's recent accusations against the church in Rome. The movement Luther started, known as the Reformation, would very soon see Europe permanently divided into Protestant countries and Catholic countries. The religious unity that had characterized the Middle Ages would be gone forever. The strangest element in the painting is the amorphous diagonal shape that seems to float in the foreground. You may not have even noticed that at first because it's weirdly kind of blends in here. Dintville's personal motto was Memento Mori, Latin for remember you must die. Holbein acknowledged this with a human skull stretched as though made of rubber. The skull is painted to come into focus when the painting is viewed close up at an angle. Death thus cuts across life and shows itself by surprise. Holbein's painting celebrates worldly splendor and human achievement, even as it reminds us that death will eventually triumph. It stands as a portrait of two men, a portrait of a friendship and a portrait of an era. So I had to read that because there's just so much information there. But that is iconography, where all these symbolize something. Even their clothes, it didn't go into it, but their clothes symbolize things. And this almost looks like something that was made in some modern video where you take a shape and turn it in space. But he was able to paint that in such a way that it just looks like a stretched out bone of some kind. But when you stepped close to the painting and looked at it, you could see the skull. And so that has a lot of deep meaning to it. And I think already you're seeing a dramatic difference between the Northern Renaissance and the Italian Renaissance. Keeping in mind, this is let me remind you, the Italian Renaissance was 1400 to 1600. So this painting by Hans Holbein was right in the middle of the time period of the Italian Renaissance. This next one, a very famous triptych by Robert Campin, is titled The Marode Altarpiece. So a triptych is a 3-panel painting like this. That's where the tri comes from. These typically would have been for the front of churches. This is a fairly simplified version, but there were some that were enormous with these hinged kind of wings on the sides. And in a church, if this were a church altarpiece, the larger ones, these actually are like doors. So if you can imagine the sides, these close in like that, and this would be covered. This would be like the middle where the doors would close shut. And then on the back side of these, there would be a painting on the back side. So when it's shut, you also see a painting. And then the doors were opened on like special high days or for different purposes. to show the scene on the inside. Now this one, I believe, is not, it's a smaller one, and so some of them were used for personal use, things that you could even carry around with you or have in your home as like a small altarpiece. This one was in a church, and so it's not small or enormous, it's in between. And what we see here is the patron saints outside the door. These are the people that paid for it. Notice again right away, before I get into too much of what's going on, look at the spacing of this thing. Do you see some trouble with proportion and perspective? Do you see doorways that look very small in comparison to the people? For instance, is this man standing or is he on his knees out here? If he's on his knees and he stands up, he wouldn't be able to get through this door. It's almost like everything is very squished in tight. However, typical of Northern Renaissance paintings is you do have deep space. They like to create like landscapes or scenery in the background that keeps going back and back and back. So here's this little scene, but then you have an open door that shows you another building way back there. So they really enjoyed creating that deep space with windows like this, and especially like this, where you see out, there's a whole city out there with people and little details. However, even though that's believable, and his perspective is not terrible here, you can see the things converging, although this doesn't converge properly. It's like he took this workbench and purposefully flipped it up so that we can see what's on it, but it's not in correct perspective. That thing needs to lay down a little bit more. So point is, none of this is in perfectly accurate mathematical perspective. They worried more about meaning than perspective. It was more important for them to show us these items on this table so it looks like it's almost flipping up, rather than for it to be drawn in proper perspective to look right. So if this were drawn in the right perspective, it would be an oval more like this, right? But because they wanted us to really see the objects on it, they just raised it up so it's almost a circle. Stuff like that. So these are the patron saints, the people that paid to have this altarpiece made. They're peering through the door, and what do they see? What scene is happening here in the middle? It is the Annunciation, where the angel Gabriel comes to tell Mary, the virgin, that she's going to have a baby. So that is what's happening here. You have lots of symbolism, lots of iconography. The candle representing the brevity of life. It can also represent, I believe that looks like it's been snuffed out, which that, along with the lily on the table and the white linen that you see laying here, all of those things represent purity, among other things in the scene, really. Between these two windows up here, if you look, let me find the windows. Between the two, oh, right here, I'm sorry. Between the two windows, there's a thing right here. Can you see that in the scene, the two round windows? There's a tiny figure of a child carrying a cross, and it's flying down on a light ray towards Mary's ear, signifying that the infant Jesus will enter Mary's womb through God's will, not through human impregnation. Then we have over here, so there's many other symbols here, but this one, we have Joseph working in his workshop that would become Mary's husband. By tradition, Joseph is making a mousetrap, symbolic of the soon-to-come Jesus, trapping the devil, bringing good to banish evil. So, interesting, lots of symbolism, lots of iconography, but the way this is painted is very typical of Northern Renaissance style. So, good example for showing that. Now we're going to move into the late Renaissance, and I think you'll see a pretty dramatic change in the way it looks. So the late Renaissance, scholars generally agree and date it to the High Renaissance in Italy is the death of Raphael in 1520. So again, we have in Italy, we have the early Renaissance, we have the high Renaissance, and the high Renaissance ends about 1520. The whole thing started in about 1400. And so while we have all this going on, we have that Northern Renaissance as well going on at the same time. But now back in Italy, we have a new style called Mannerism, which starts to evolve. It comes from the Latin manneria, meaning style or stylishness. And so this painting by Tintoretto is called The Last Supper, and it's a great one to compare to Da Vinci's Last Supper. So again, this is late Renaissance. Da Vinci's is high Renaissance. Let me just click over to show you that one again so you can see them side by side or near each other. So take a look at this one for a moment. 1592. Here's Da Vinci's 1495. Quite a bit of difference there. 1499, 1592. So they're 100 years apart. And Da Vinci would be high Renaissance. Tintoretto is late Renaissance. And this shows that style of mannerism that you start to see in the the late Renaissance works in Italy. So some things that you see here are the table is set at a dramatic diagonal to kind of emphasize the tension and the drama. Not only do we see, well, you're just looking at it, what do you notice that's very different about this one in the scene? What's happening here? So I already mentioned there's a lot going on here supernaturally, kind of behind the scenes, but we also have all this going on. We have a servant person washing something, the floor maybe, I can't tell. There's a cat getting into her basket. There's this guy delivering the food. So there's all kinds of servants here as well. Not biblical, I don't think, but it shows a very different perspective on this scene. We also have Jesus breaking the bread. So he's in the middle of introducing the elements of bread and wine, the communion elements. So we have exaggerated, we have emotional. It's very dark. Do you see the dramatically dark shadows as compared to what we looked at with the high Renaissance? Let me flip back because again, the high Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, very different looking than this late and even the Northern Renaissance that we kind of showed that. We took a trip up north briefly to show you the works that were going on in the north. But look at this one again. Look at this Sistine Chapel ceiling and how, in my first impression, there are many dark colors in there, but it's almost just like lighter, prettier, pastel-y more. It's not, but it feels that way in comparison to this. Do you see the dramatic change and how this has that deep, deep dark shadows? That gives it a very dramatic theatrical, like there's a very strong light source shining on the scene. Okay, so that's more typical of the late Renaissance and even this style of mannerism that's creeping in. And mannerism, I don't know if you noticed in the video, but it did say beyond this one, this example that I'm showing you, some of mannerisms paintings are even more dramatic and start to have like out of proportion, like stretching people, elongating people to non-realistic dimensions. So for that exaggerated drama, like almost purposefully making people look weird and out of shape for the dramatic effect. So a little more about mannerism. This artwork grew out of the possibilities suggested by the high Renaissance works like Michelangelo created. And it was characterized by a fondness for elaborate or obscure subject matter. And then this one is just one example. Now this is pretty tame and normal, but you can see it says she's a self-portrait at the easel. And if you look at the painting she's painting, you start to see some of that manneristic technique come through. Oftentimes children or babies are painted like adult proportions. They just look like weird adults. It's kind of strange looking how the babies look in manneristic paintings. So we have one more video, which will take us right to the end of class. This is the end of this lecture, but I'll finish with this video, and I believe this is on mannerism, so we'll get a little more.
When you first look at a Mannerist painting, you might be tempted to think that it's a product of the Italian Renaissance, and you'd be right, sort of. Mannerism is a period of art that came out of the High Renaissance in Italy, and it's also known as the Late Renaissance period. It lasted from about 1520 to 1580. The influence of the Renaissance style is clear in the paintings of the Mannerist movement. There are figures from religion and mythology, rich colors and careful details, all of which you would expect from the art of this age. But when you look again, you discover that something's a little off. Upon closer inspection, you realize that the figures are distorted. No one's neck is that long. No human can maintain that distorted pose. No one's skin is that bright. The lines are kind of exaggerated, aren't they? And the geographical setting is unclear. The space is strange. That's when you realize this isn't Renaissance art. This is Mannerism. The Mannerists knew what they were doing when they created these slightly odd images and presented them as genuine. Distorting elements such as scale and perspective, adding drama in subtle ways whenever they could, were exactly the look they were going for. The name Mannerism comes directly from the first known art historian, Giorgio Vasari. Giorgio himself was a Mannerist artist and used the Italian term maniera, meaning style, in his encyclopedia to describe the period in which he worked. Many art historians believe that the Mannerists were making commentary on the manners or style or proper art, proper anatomy, and even proper Christian virtue. Mannerists took cues from the Renaissance artists about matters such as bright color, fine detail, and a focus on individualism and the human form, but applied these ideas in a way that transformed their style. Mannerist artists departed from the ideals of mathematical, anatomical, spatial, and even scenic perfection of the Renaissance. In breaking these rules and depicting unrealistic body proportions, poses, colors, and settings, they opened imaginative possibilities for juxtaposed scenes, vibrant color, and perfect elegance. Mannerist paintings are often filled with tension. Rather than depicting an important scene or action, they frequently show the moment just before the action takes place. Consider Tintoretto and his painting of the Last Supper. Depicted from almost an offstage viewpoint, it is darker and more fraught with suspense than Da Vinci's more famous painting of the same scene. The lighting is more harsh and surreal. There are more figures off to the side, and distorted poses and elongated angels watch from up above, all distinctly Mannerist characteristics. Raphael and Michelangelo, well-known painters of the Italian Renaissance, were also among the first artists to experiment with painting in a Mannerist style. Francesco Mazzola, more commonly known as Parmigiano, followed these Renaissance heroes' example and became one of the first characteristically Mannerist painters. Parmigiano's self-portrait in a convex mirror shows the artist painting his own distorted figure. The painting Entombment by Jacopo Pontormo features an unnaturally elongated Christ and surrounding figures bent and posed uncomfortably. Unlike many Renaissance paintings, Entombment is not didactic, with a specific dogmatic message in mind, but invites contemplation and opens itself up to interpretation. Like the figures in Pontormo's entombment, the subjects of El Greco's Baptism of Christ are punctuated by long torsos and loud splashes of color. El Greco began his painting career near Venice, but fully developed his talents after moving to Spain. He is known for his intensely emotional depictions of religious scenes. In El Greco's Baptism of Christ, the viewer's gaze is directed to all corners of the painting, and the postures and dramatic lighting of the painting create a sense of movement and urgency. As with most trends in exaggeration, mannerism could last only so long. By the close of the 1500s, it was yielding to the less strange, highly detailed, and more theatrical art of the Baroque movement.